This video will focus on the discussion of poetry under child and adolescent literature. Definition and description. Poetry, in the form of nursery rhymes, is a natural beginning to literature for young children and an enjoyable literary form for all ages. In their earliest years, children acquire language and knowledge of the world around them through listening and observing. Poetry, primarily an oral form of literature that draws heavily on the auditory perceptions of the listeners, is ideally suited to young children. Throughout the elementary and middle school years, poetry that relates to topics and issues being explored in the classroom can be shared orally, providing a flash of humor or a new perspective. Poetry is a concentrated expression of ideas and feelings through precise and imaginative words carefully selected for their sonorous and rhythmical effects. Originally, poetry was oral, recited by minstrels as they traversed the countryside, sharing poems and songs with listeners of all ages. The musicality of poetry makes it an especially suitable literary form for teachers to read aloud and at times to put to music. Children often believe that rhyme is an essential ingredient of poetry, yet some types of poetry do not rhyme. What then distinguishes poetry from prose? The concentration of thought and feeling expressed in succinct, exact, and beautiful language, as well as underlying pulse or rhythm, are the traits that most strongly set poetry apart from prose. Not all rhyming, rhythmical language merits the label of poetry. Verse is a language form in which simple thoughts or stories are told in rhyme with a distinct beat or meter. Mother Goose and nursery rhymes are good examples of well-known simple verses for children. And, of course, we are all too aware of the jingle, a catchy repetition of sounds heard so often in commercials. The most important feature of verses and jingles is their strong rhyme and rhythm. Content is often light or even silly. Although verses and jingles are enjoyable and engage children, poetry enriches children's lives by giving new insights and fresh views of life experiences and by bringing forth strong emotional responses. The term poetry is used in this discussion both to refer to a form of language that can evoke great depth of feeling and provoke new insights through imaginative and beautiful language and to refer to favorite verses of childhood. Evaluation and selection. The criteria to keep in mind in evaluating a poem for use with children are as follows. The ideas and feelings expressed are authentic, fresh, and imaginative. The expression of the ideas and feelings is unique, often causing the reader to perceive ordinary things in new ways. The poem is appropriate to experiences of children and does not preach to them. Poetry collections should be judged on the quality of the poetry choices first and illustrations and the appearance of the book second. Beautiful illustrations do not ensure a good collection of poems within the covers. Children report a preference for narrative poems, and so these poems are a good choice for classroom sharing. Although certain poets may be favored by your students, they will also enjoy the poetry of many other writers. Thus, be sure to share poems of a variety of poets. In selecting poems to read to students, the list of notable poets and the list of poets who have won the National Council of Teachers of English (NCTE) award are good starting points. The NCTE award was established in 1977 in the United States to honor living U.S. poets whose poetry has contributed substantially to the lives of children. This award is given to a poet for the entire body of writing for children ages 3 through 13 and is now given every 3 years. Although more poetry for children is being written, published, and enjoyed by many teachers and their students, some teachers report that they do not share poetry because of their uncertainty about selecting poems of their students. By learning about students' preferences in poetry and some of the best beloved poems and most respected poets, a teacher can become more skillful at selecting poems that engage students. Children's poetry preferences. The findings from surveys of children's poetry preferences can be helpful to teachers in selecting poems for a new group of students. Fisher and Nataleria 1982 surveyed primary grade children and their teachers, and Terry 1974 studied intermediate grade children. The two age groups were similar, although not identical in their preferences. Both age groups preferred narrative poems over lyric poems. Limericks were the favored poetic form of both age groups. Free verse and haiku were not well liked by either age groups. Children of both age groups preferred poems that had pronounced sound patterns of all kinds, but especially enjoyed poems that rhymed. Rhythm was an important element to students of both age groups. They preferred poems with regular, distinctive rhythm. Children of both age groups like humorous poems, poems about animals, and poems about enjoyable, familiar experiences. The subjects most preferred by primary grade children were strange and fantastic events, animals, and other children. The older children preferred the realistic contents of humor, enjoyable, familiar experiences, and animals. Children in both age groups often found figurative language in poetry confusing. Children's appreciation of poetry can be broadened and deepened by a good teacher, but you may be wise to proceed with caution on less liked aspects of poetry until your students become fans of poetry. Thus, a good selection of rhyming, narrative poems with distinct rhythms about humorous events, well-liked familiar experiences, and animals is a good starting point for students who have little experience with poetry. Poetry in the classroom. Young children delight in the sounds and language play of poetry. Yet, by 5th grade, students typically indicate that poetry is their least favorite genre. What happens to cause this huge shift? School. Poetry is the most misused genre in classrooms, often chosen for memorization and handwriting practice. Poetry tends to be neglected, seldom shared until the dreaded poetry unit comes along and bombards students with abstract poems that they are expected to analyze in order to uncover the hidden meanings. The result is that students often build a lifelong dislike of poetry instead of being provided with experiences that create a lifelong love of poetry. Students listening to and saying poems. Teachers and librarians can begin by providing even very young students with many opportunities to hear and say poems. Later, when students have developed a love of poetry and an affinity for the language play in poems, students can read poetry by fine poets and by their classmates and can begin to write poems themselves. In other words, poetry needs to be shared in both oral and written forms. Poetry should be introduced first and often to children in an oral form. Because poetry was originally an oral form of literature, it still relies heavily on the auditory perception of listeners. Moreover, children's oral language is the basis for their later acquisition of literacy. These two facts combine nicely to make listening to and saying poems a natural early introduction to literature for children. Some teachers report that they do not share poetry with their students because of their uncertainty about how to read it aloud. By practicing the poems ahead of time and by reading poetry frequently, a teacher can overcome this reluctance. The rewards to both students and teachers are worth the effort. Reading poetry aloud to children. Poetry should be read aloud to students on a daily basis. Elster and Hanover 2002, in examining how kindergarten to 4th grade teachers shared poems with their students, found that reading poetry aloud with expression is effective in drawing children's attention to literate language. Brief, positive encounters with 1 to 3 poems at a time are best. Too many poems in one sitting may overwhelm the students or make the reading tedious. Introduce the poem to the class before reading it aloud, either by tying the poem in with something else or by briefly telling why you chose this poem. Then state the title of the poem and begin to read. After reading the poem, be sure to announce the name of the poet so that students discover the writers they especially enjoy. In addition, the following points will help you to read poetry well. Keep in mind that poetry should be read for its meaning. Stress the meaning elements of the poem just as you do when reading prose. The pauses must be determined by the meaning units of the poem, not by the end of the lines. A reader should not overemphasize the beat of the poem. Doing so results in an annoying sing-song effect. Let the poetic language provide the rhythm. Poetry should be enunciated clearly. Each sound and each syllable of a poem are important and must be heard to be appreciated. You may need to slow down your normal reading pace to give full value to each sound. Poetry begs to be performed and dramatized. Try out different effects, using different voices, elongating words, singing, shouting, whispering, pausing dramatically, and so on, as you read poems aloud. Your voice is a powerful tool. You may change it from louder to softer to only a whisper. You may start at a deep low pitch and rise to a medium and eventually high pitch. You may speak very quickly in a clipped fashion and then slow down and draw out the words. Some poems may need to be read aloud a number of times for the meaning to be fully understood by listeners. Also, favorite poems can be enjoyed again and again as teachers and students savor one more reading. Consider recording poems for the listening center and making them available along with the poem in print, on a chart or in a book, for the student to listen to and read. Commercially made recordings of popular poets reading their works, accompanied by music, are available and quite popular with children. Some teachers have asked parents to peruse a poetry anthology, select a favorite poem, and then recording their reading of the poem for use in the listening center. After reading a poem aloud, some form of response is usually enjoyed. Some poems warrant discussion, and students can take the opportunity to tell how the poem made them feel or what it made them think about. Ask, what meaning does the poem have for you? Choral poetry. A time-honored technique for providing opportunities to say and hear poems over and over again is given by choral poetry. Choral poetry consists of interpreting and saying a poem together as a group activity. These poems may be practiced and recited or read aloud. Students enjoy this way of experiencing poetry because they have a participatory role in the activity. Most poetry intended to be listened to is suitable for choral presentation. Learning to read poetry. Children enjoy reading poetry silently and aloud to others. The classroom library corner should have one or two comprehensive poetry anthologies for students to browse through for general purposes. In addition, specialized collections by a single poet are needed as well. Students can be encouraged to make copies of their favorite poems from these various collections to develop personal individual anthologies. Many students choose to illustrate these and arrange the poems in new and inventive ways. Rotating the poetry books occasionally over the course of the school year will spark renewed interest in reading poetry. Other activities to encourage the reading of poetry by the students follow. Place students in pairs to take turns reading favorite poems to one another. Make videotapes or audio tapes of these readings and permit students to listen to or watch their own and other students' readings of poetry. Ask each student to select 3 poems by one poet, for example, a Golden Age poet or an NCTE poet, and find something out about the poet. Then place students in groups of 5 or 6 to tell briefly about the poet and read the 3 poems aloud. Have students find 3 poems on the same topic, such as dinosaurs, baseball, or friendship, then read them aloud in small groups. Encourage students to find poems that are of the same poetic form, cinquains, limericks, etc., or that exhibit similar poetic elements, rhyme, alliteration, onomatopoeia, etc., or that have fast or slow rhythms. These poems can then comprise the poems for reading aloud that day or week. Learning to write poetry. A rich poetry environment stimulates children's interest in writing their own poems. Children need to be familiar with poetry of many kinds and by many poets before they should be expected to compose poems. Teachers often start the writing of poetry as a collaborative effort. The class brainstorms ideas and composes the poem orally as the teacher writes it on the board or on a chart paper. As students become comfortable with writing group poetry, they can branch off and compose poems in pairs or individually. Children should be reminded that poetry is a form of communication and that they should think of an idea, feeling, or event to write about in their poems. They should be reminded that poetry does not have to rhyme and that they may write about something of interest to them. Children's poetry follows no absolute rules. Perfection of form should not be a goal. Other suggestions to foster poetry writing include the following. Number 1. Have students compile personal and class anthologies of their own poems or their favorite poem. Design bulletin boards with displays of students' own poems as well as copies of poems by favorite poets. Students may also design posters, individually or in groups, to illustrate a favorite poem that is displayed around the school for a few weeks. Third, encourage students to model the works of professional poets by attempting imitation of a whole poem or of specific techniques. Fourth, read aloud many poems of one poetic form, then analyze the form with the students to reveal the characteristics of its structure. Quatrains, cinquains, haiku, concrete poems, and limericks can all be used as models with students once they have an appreciation for poetry and for the specific poetic form. And that ends this presentation on poetry about child and adolescent literature. Please do not forget to like and subscribe on this channel.